Well, good afternoon, everybody, and I hope you've had an enjoyable day so far. This session is on monitoring for accountability. So I'm just going to present on the Accountability Pact, and then you'll have some good discussion after that, I'm sure. So let me just share my screen. So we're going to talk about monitoring for accountability, and I'd just like to start by talking about the Accountability Pact. So this is a process that we put in place just before the UN Food Systems Summit to try to bring together researchers and people working in this area to kind of commit to increasing and continuing and expanding the application of this research on food systems monitoring for accountability. And you'll see on the right-hand side, committing to generating this evidence, translating it, advocating for applying the evidence in the food system transformation. So I'm going to just go through this accountability framework, which we adapted from Vivica Clark's work that you see on the left-hand side. So the objectives of the Accountability Pact were to promote the alignment and coherence amongst the multiple groups working in this area, so that we've got synergies across the various monitoring systems. We want to actively track governments and their progress from all the commitments they made at the UN Food Systems Summit. We want to provide this monitoring data to support the efforts of civil society and all those advocating for improved food systems, and we want to increase the accountability literacy within the food systems ecosystem. So while I'm talking about an accountability cycle and a food systems, we need to think about these as ecosystems where there's lots of different relationships between various moving parts and actors. So these are the groups that came together to join and call for an accountability pact. We've had over 250 odd researchers sign up to this, committing to increasing their efforts in this place. So a lot of great international actors working there. So this accountability cycle, let me just take you through this. So at the center, there's at the center is where you set the account. This is usually whoever has the authority to be able to make changes within the food system. That's usually government, but there's other actors in there as well. And then taking the account, which is doing the measuring, sharing the account, communicating that, holding to account, which is where the enforcement comes in, and responding to the account, the improvements. So let's go through those each individually. So setting the account. Now, this is usually around defining the objectives and targets for action. And these usually need to be smart indicators, so specific and measurable in particular, so that we can measure and monitor and track those over time. The big challenge with setting the account is that when governments or WHO or various groups give commitments about what they're going to do, they're usually not in a smart format. They're usually not measurable. And so part of the role of researchers can do is to convert what commitments government do make and try to turn those into something that can be measured. Another way of doing it is to create indicators not of what governments are committing to do, but what actually needs to be done to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals in relation to food. And we can identify that from a lot of documents which have already been published about what needs to be done. And this is a job of researchers to be able to take those commitments and say, okay, how would we go about measuring and monitoring those? And so using our expertise about how to create indicators out of those. So that's kind of setting the account, the two ways that you can do that. Taking the account, so this is what we're used to as researchers. This is what we generally do. We know how to measure things. And what we want to do is to not only create a measurement tool that can measure progress towards targets, but it's also providing a lot of additional information about the state of the food system, where the gaps are, and so on. Its independence is really valuable, and that's why having academia involved in this gives a state of confidence about the outcomes. And it's also a tool for collaboration. So you're using the process of measuring to bring together researchers, bring together civil society groups to be able to take this evidence to the decision makers. So there's lots of examples out there, the Food System Dashboard, INFORMAS, Access to Nutrition Initiative, and so on. So, you know, there are examples out there that where researchers have rallied around and created these measuring tools. So now we've got the evidence, we've got the data. The next challenge is to share the account. And this involves us going a little bit beyond what we would normally do, which is collect evidence and put it out there into the scientific literature. Here we want to be able to share it in a way that makes it accessible to those people using the data, accessible to the policymakers, accessible to the private sector actors, and accessible to the civil society kind of activists who are banging the drum trying to get action. And there's a bit of a role here, I think, for academics to get into what's called scholar activism. So researchers alongside civil society activists, helping them in the evidence space to develop their strategic communications using the evidence that we've collected. So lots of different roles there as a translator of evidence and information for people in academia. The fourth part of the cycle, or this ecosystem, to be more true to what it really is, but we're thinking about it in terms of a cycle, just so that it's simpler. This part, holding to account. This is the biggest and the most challenging area. Holding to account means that there are some power relationships whereby one party can provide incentives and disincentives on another party to act and to drive towards the desired actions. And in this instance, academia, civil society have relatively little power. They have low power compared with governments and the private sector. So playing in this space means that we have very little kind of leverage. But that doesn't mean to say we have no leverage. And I think that we can bring our respected voices to this place and try to leverage what power we do have for action. So research regarding the impact of stakeholder actions, the extent of progress against targeted, these can all be leverages for this power and showing where they are meeting the goals and not meeting. Connecting actors and providing these tools is really helpful for strengthening accountability. So this is the tough space to work in, but researchers and civil society can have a role here. Responding to the account. This is actually relatively easy. Once you've got actors, for example, a government says, yes, we want to move in this particular area, then I think there's usually no shortage of experts from academia and from civil society who will step in and help design government or company policies or actions, providing data, bringing expertise and evidence to the table when they're wanting to act. So that's the kind of cycle, if you like, of accountability, and there's roles for people in all of those 5 areas. But as I said, it operates in reality. These things all happen rather simultaneously and in a rather messy ecosystem type of way, rather than in a nice, neat cycle, as I've just articulated. So we can now move into a discussion. People who might be thinking about getting into this area, lifting their own research, their own work within the African countries for increasing food environments monitoring for accountability. You'll face a number of challenges which will be unique to your countries and your regions, and so it might be worth sharing those. What's the capacity within the group? What's the receptivity of various actors? How do you get access to them, and so on? So it might be worth going around the table thinking about the challenges to doing this. What are the capacity building activities needed to strengthen this? So, you know, have a discussion about if you do have people willing and keen to get into this area, what are the training needs? What are the linkages with others in the area that might help? And then finally, how do we use this evidence? What are the ways that we can use this evidence within government, within civil society? People have different stories, how different pieces of evidence have found traction under different circumstances, and it might be worth sharing those. So that's my little spiel to start off the discussion. So all the best in working through some of those questions and other questions that you'll have. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, boys. Over to Peter. Peter, take it over.
Okay, thanks, Amos. Yes, this could be an interesting session depending on the experiences, challenges, and queries that this may have. Maybe we can pause the screen on this last slide, if that makes sense. So for people to consider these different queries and think about what is it that they are facing in their monitoring and accountability efforts within sub-Saharan Africa, and what capacity building activities are needed. If you take it one by one, maybe you can open the floor and ask people what they think are the main challenges they are facing, or African countries in general are facing in increasing food environments monitoring. You can raise your hand, or you can just speak up, unmute, and let me hear your voice. Is there anybody willing to take the floor?
I think there's a hand up, Dr. Namakolo Kovic, I see. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to break the ice.
Sure.
I think the first challenge is we are not monitoring. So it's not necessarily a challenge of how can we monitor better, we're not even doing it. So I think the first issue would be to have some decisions around what do we need to monitor and why. Why is it important, especially in the current ambience of food systems transformation? So countries are saying we want to transform our food system. But a lot of African countries, what I've noticed is that they've developed their food systems transformation plans around existing programs that they're actually already implementing to try and enhance those. So that could be the basis of, if our food environments transform in a positive direction, what is that direction, and what does a good destination look like? And then we need to have some discussions around what then do we monitor over time, and of course, what do we do about it? Then the second big challenge is resources. Yeah, it will lead into the capacity thing, but definitely resources will be an issue. Who's going to pay for the monitoring process? Can our policy makers consider this important enough to put money to it? Thank you.
Thank you, Namakolo. Very interesting points. I see another hand raised. Kobe, do you want to add to that or comment?
Yeah, excellent. Yes, so some of the main challenges, especially from a marketing perspective, as I'm coming from, is mediatization, for example, and then of course the increasing capacity of the commercial world. You find that the media is saturated. I mean, we have a saturation of advertising content, and that is increasingly putting pressure on citizenship, and then of course is making monitoring very difficult. Apart from that, you see that I think there is lack of sort of a cohesion or lack of, collaboration between the commercial world and the health authorities or the regulators. So increasingly you find, regulators, being sort of crowded out by the commercial power of producers, for example. And I also, through this conversation, I was asking myself, to what extent is the influence of China, for example, on food labeling? Because if you look at most of the food sources, I mean, increasingly we are sourcing hugely food from China. And most of these Chinese packages aren't translated into English. I mean, in the past, you find French companies, translating, labels into English. Obviously, English firms going to France, translated into French. We don't have Chinese labels being translated into English. And so there's also a challenge there. And I'm thinking, how do we solve some of these issues? So these are some of the challenges that I'm actually identifying, from my end as a marketing person from that perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Kobe. Very valid points indeed. Kap, you want to comment on that?
Yes. Well, I'm wondering, like Dr. Namkolo said earlier, the aspect is whether we even have the key standards that we have agreed on as a country or as countries in monitoring our environment, our food environment as it stands. As you run through some of the issues that, for example, we face within our own country context, there are a lot of guidelines that are now being developed. Food-based dietary guidelines and what have you. And the challenge also about the enforcement of labeling, for example, whether foods are to be, I mean, the discussions that are going on whether food are to be labeled in a way that consumers can easily pick up the issues that relate to the foods that they are consuming, most especially the processed foods that we have. The aspect also of what exists as far as funding for monitoring these processes are concerned is also of an issue, as many of these food regulation authorities also have other competing interests, and then also that they need to fix. So it makes keeping track of the environment more of a responsibility that lies around researchers within the country, as well as the academia within the country, who are also not really funded in country to monitor some of these processes that we have, some of these issues that are of importance to the country level. So it stands to hold as a challenge because the competing needs are not allowing for that, and there are no in-country support to some of these monitoring systems that are there.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Spiel to start off the discussion. So
thanks, Kap.
I'm so sorry, Peter. So I was trying to raise my hand, and yeah, I accidentally paused it. So let me share the questions again whilst the others are talking. So sorry about that. I'll share it soon.
Okay, no worries. So the point taken about the need for funding and resources was also raised by Namukolo. I don't know, Namukolo, if you want to comment on this point. I see you still have your hand raised.
Yeah, I was actually putting my hand to add to what is it Kap said? What he said. Two things. One is, if we are going to monitor food environments, it's not the responsibility of the people that are doing business in food to actually monitor the environment, because that's their job, is to really adhere to the food environments that are described through government structures or their own institutional structures. So I think the issue of standards is important, and it's not necessarily an area that we've done very well in. There are some aspects of food environments in relation to food safety of those in food environments where we have what we might call standards, because many African countries actually do have food safety requirements. But even when we have those, enforcement is usually the problem. We manage to put things on paper, but we actually not able to enforce. The institutions that are supposed to be monitoring do not have the capacities or resources to move around and do the monitoring that is required, or to collect the data. The academic institutions, they may collect data and tell us how bad the situation is or what we might need to do about it. So perhaps there is need to look to the academic institution for assistance on the monitoring part. We constantly needing to churn out students. And so really the fact that we need people to collect monitoring data should be an opportunity to link up to academic institutions to do that on behalf of governments. And then doing so in an independent way, in that they're not attached to the industries. At the continental level, there are some aspects that are going on specifically related to food safety, in that there is a food safety index that was developed to be part of the CADEP biannual review process. And the idea there is we seem to be able to meet standards when we are exporting products, but not for ourselves. And so what can we benefit from there? But for food environments per se, within each country, it's a pity, I actually haven't seen it. I've been quite engaged in the UN Food System Summit, but I haven't seen as much emphasis on food environments as one would have liked. So it is an area where we need to set standards, because what is happening is not helpful, especially the kind of dietary transitions that we are having and the way in which foods are being marketed, the kinds of false claims that are being made to unsuspecting consumers. All of those would allow us to develop some kind of standards around which we can now do this accountability thing. I was looking at those 5 items there, and when I was looking at item 2 on take account, that take account should including taking account of item 4 on holding account as well. So those that are holding account and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think we need a range of consultations within countries to set those standards, so that as we seek to transform our food systems, we do so also looking at the food environment as something that should complement the transformation, and not an afterthought later on when we start getting into trouble, or we are already in trouble. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hanoko. I see Amos, yes, you have your hand raised, but Rachel also had some comments.
Maybe Rachel before me. Rachel?
Hi, sure. This is Rachel Gilbert. I'm joining from the Food Prices for Nutrition project at Tufts University. We'll be talking actually on the 17th of November about a little bit about this topic, but I wanted to raise the possibility of taking advantage of the data that's already collected by governments. For example, food price data. A big challenge, of course, is to collect high quality data, and some of that is already being collected and not used as widely as possible. And I think one one aspect. I don't see the questions anymore. I think one of the questions is what types of capacity strengthening activities are needed for this. And I think, of course, there's work to be done on figuring out what metrics and what uses of the data are most feasible. But the challenge that I see also is that, of course, adding on the monitoring, and Namakolo, I think you mentioned this as well, it's a big task that adding on the use of the data after the collection is quite a big task that can't just be tacked onto somebody's job that's already quite full or quite busy. So, sorry. Oh, I thought I heard someone speaking, but so I think one challenge is to determine who reasonably has the time and can be targeted for the capacity to do this type of monitoring. It's really not something I think that should be added to the burden of somebody who's already doing quite a lot of work. That doesn't really incentivize people to be excited about monitoring tasks. So I hope there'll be a lot of discussion about this in regards to food price data in next week's session, but I just thought I would add that.
Thanks, Rachel. Amos, you want to go?
Yes, thank you, Peter. I just wanted to reiterate some of the points shared by Dr. Namakolo-Kovic. I think two of them are truly very important challenges that we face. So one, as she indicated, is the fact that there may be no interest. So if there's no interest, you wouldn't even be motivated to put structures or resources in place to monitor. And where there's interest, then comes this lack of capacity. So you may have interest to monitor, you are willing to monitor, but you don't have the capacity. Even sometimes you have resources in terms of money, the human capacity, the expertise to do the monitoring, then becomes another challenge. And to address that challenge, I think a network like this and others, including, for example, the African Nutrition Society and similar others in the region that have been trying over the years to bring stakeholders together, even if it is once a year or once in 2 years, to help to build our capacity to be able to do some of these things is something that we should laud. If you look at the food environment specific actions of nations, and some of us have been involved in the INFORMAS model implementation and monitoring in the region for some time now. Of course, the INFORMAS work is not the only form of food environment monitoring, but it seems to have caught up and is popular in other regions. If you look at Africa, South Africa tried to do that, I think, started it in 2016. They implemented the food EP. It took several years before Ghana and Kenya attempted then to implement, and we were able to do that in 2018 and 2019. So currently, I think a team in Senegal working with Northern partners are implementing the food EP model, I think in about 4 or 6 French-speaking countries. Uganda, Tanzania currently doing the food EP. Ghana, in addition to the food EP, is also doing some work relating to monitoring on food promotion, food provisioning. So hopefully, if we have a lot more members in the region getting exposed to this and then expression interest, we would see some work being done. The only challenge is that this work can not be done completely by independent academics. I do agree, as far as monitoring is concerned, it's good to have the actors being independent, right? Because if you bring industry actors, and we do know based on existing literature that self-regulation, as they usually would refer to it, that does not work. They would say, okay, we'll do it, or we'll do it ourselves, and then they would not do what they're supposed to be doing. So that is true. But we would need to work very closely with government actors as well, because one of academic project may not do the trick. We need to have what these academics start institutionalize, get integrated into existing systems or structures of collecting data. So if you take, for example, in Ghana, we have what is referred to as DIMS, DIMS 1, DIMS 2. If we are able to engage Ghana Health Service, Ministry of Health, and other actors who are in charge of this to ensure that they introduce food environment relevant indicators into this. Some of those indicators will then get picked up and collected, recorded by routine work by our health workers, by our government employees. And so I think we have to look forward to that. Once we get there, then we can then pat ourselves on the back and say, yes, food environment monitoring is gotten to a stage that we would like it to be. The academics have started, but they need the support and involvement of government actors to get to this stage. So over to you, Peter.
Thanks very much, Amos, for that comment, because, yeah, I must say I completely agree with you. There's a strong need for engaging policymakers from the very onset, actually. So that speaks to the topic of integrated knowledge translation. To give you some background, you mentioned the food epi exercise that we did in South Africa, for example, in 2016. I was also involved in that. There was a round of like a Delphi-based sort of survey to assess the different indicators against the benchmarks, and it was successful, but it was very difficult to reach the policymakers, and we could not even the results were hardly shared, so that the evidence did not reach the policy level, so to speak, because there was not that, the support of an IKT strategy from the get-go, which is becoming increasingly important in any major international project, as you know. And for me, this holds true for the food environment as well. So we need to include policymakers from the very beginning in order to stand any chance of evidence being taken up and translated. But then obviously you could ask yourself or ourselves the question, if we as academics are the best people or the best actors in this regard, and if we have enough capacity to do so. And that speaks to the second question that Boyd put on his slides regarding the need for capacity building. So I would want to find out amongst colleagues and peers what is their sense of the capacity that is needed amongst ourselves in terms of knowledge translation and how to make things work in terms of evidence uptake. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that, or Sinamukolo, you still want to comment on previous comments?
Yes, but I'll link it to the capacity thing. I will be quick. Currently, for the UN Food Systems Summit process, the African Union, the member state worked on a common position. And that the idea is to work on issues that would help in creating collective momentum across borders. Simultaneously, we've also had the launch of the Africa Continental Trade Agreement. The secretariat, I think, is in Accra in Ghana. Now that, for it to work, I mean, we'll have to deal with food environment issues that are common across borders. And then the African Union is working on incorporating these food safety and other issues into the CATEP biannual review process, which is taking place every 2 years. Now, all African countries are responding to this. Even those countries that are not implementing CATEP are actually doing the biannual review. So these are areas of capacity entry points for policymakers on things that they are already doing, that they have already agreed to doing. And so looking at the strengths there, and the important thing there is the fact that the decision was made that what would be monitored, for example, for food safety, is not going to be safety of commodities, but of systems, the development of systems for the country to be able to monitor food safety and the like. I think there's an opportunity to be proactive and work towards looking at what could be done about food environment that might be common across countries, because as it is, we are messing each other's food environments up. so the trade footprint, for example, that South Africa has for food on the African continent is huge. If they can fix the way in which they deal with the food environment and advertising and what have you, you kill multiple birds with that one stone. So the trade agreement versus the biannual review process that the countries have agreed to, they all create opportunities for us to do more. And in that mix, what could academics do to help the situation? What might be the capacities needed to allow them to be able to help in building that momentum? Thank you.
Thanks, Namakolo. Indeed, very important points. Again, reiterating the need to think through any knowledge translation strategy in great detail. Whether mostly knowledge translation happens quite often on an ad hoc basis, you know, based on personal relationships or people in government that you happen to meet or communicate with. But putting in place a structured, systematic way of translating knowledge by integrating policymakers from the get-go and then communicating in that structured way might actually help. But I wonder if there's enough capacity, again, amongst academics to do so. And that also, as pointed out earlier, requires a lot of resources, which may lead us to, well, in view, especially of considering or contemplating the role of the private sector and the food industry and the transnational corporations, as you rightly pointed out, and for example, dominating the food market and lobbying at government level. What do we put against that? How can we put pressure, and who do we involve? As academics, we can work with civil society, which can have a platform, yes or no, but quite often lack the necessary resources, as you said, or the funding. So how do we go about this? Do we look for funding in philanthropic foundations? Do we look elsewhere? How best to establish a platform apart from the networking, the forum and the FERN network, for example, that Amos has established? Is there any thoughts around that, about who might be the best partners or tools to use to better increase the uptake of evidence and to lobby for our agenda? Is there anybody who wants to comment on that? Namakolo, you still have your hand raised?
Apologies, it's a legacy hand this time. Sorry.
No worries. Amos, what is your take, or what is your experience in working or setting up this platform, even because you have high-profile stakeholders? How easy or difficult was it to start working with them? What might be points of leverage in order to nudge the system so we can have a more meaningful impact, if you want, on food systems transformation and evidence uptake in that whole ecosystem?
Thank you, Peter. And yes, I would come to that about, yes, going to respond to your earlier question about how do we do it once we do not have the resources and we do not have the capacity. And so to come back to this, I think one way to do is to network, as we are doing here. Individually, we may be resource constraint, capacity deficit glaring. But once we come together, the little you have, the little you know, add it to mine, we can make a significant impact. And that informed the formation of this FERN network, where actors from within the global South are able to interact and then to share. For example, Ghana might have some capacity relating to a specific component of food environment. South Africa might have, and they do have, and you have a lot given what we have listened to from this breakout room, the presentations that we have gotten from South Africa. And so leveraging on what each of us as individual countries have in a group like this can really be impactful, because as actors with common philosophy of addressing a common problem, which is malnutrition we all want to address, most of the actors sometimes are able to share their resources and share it openly and freely without asking for remuneration or compensation, right? And so staff collaboration, as we are doing right now, with also northern partners whose work relates directly or indirectly to what we are doing here in Africa, I think is one way to address this problem of not having resources, not having capacity, and yet there are so many problems to address. So collaboration. So I think I'm going back to that word, collaboration. So we should learn, I just learned a new term a few days ago about competition, right? Other than competing, we should learn to be competing, where you have people probably with different interests or similar interests. Other than competing among themselves, you bring the resources together, and then together we can solve bigger problems that individually we couldn't. I think that is one way. The other way is that, especially in Africa, I'm not saying governments are grossly insensitive and unresponsive, but there are times when governments are not responsive to the demands that we place on them too. And so one way to get them to respond, I think we have learned over the past couple of years, is to find a way of letting them hear what they want to hear. And by saying letting them hear what they want to hear, those of us from Ghana have heard of what used to be the dead goat syndrome. Irrespective of how you beat a dead goat, it is dead, it won't respond. And politicians or a number of governments in Africa have developed that syndrome, right? And so to resurrect them is to sing the songs that that dead goat would wake up from its death. And so not only do we as monitors only have to be interested in naming and shaming, we should also learn to name and praise. And politicians, especially African politicians, once you name and praise each peer, it gingers them to do what they need to do to also get praised. So as we monitor, let's have that in mind. We should name and shame, but at the same time, where there's an opportunity, let's name and also praise. And we may have them joining us to fight this common problem.
It's very well said, I think. Maybe to play the devil's advocate a little bit, I was wondering about the role of money. Of course, we all know where the money sits and who influences government and what government also listens to. You say, okay, positive rewards, not only blaming and shaming, but also praising. And what about quite often a useful tactic might be building an investment case. It's just showing the benefit of introducing certain some legislation. I think about the sugar tax, for example. So the only way we could convince government in South Africa was basically because we could convince Treasury that it was going to be a return on investment by implementing the sugar tax. So that argument, but that obviously requires a lot of prior research. We need to do cost effectiveness analysis and so forth in order to inform governments. And that is an argument that they might be willing to listen to. I don't know if anybody has any comments on that. Namokolo?
Yeah, I think the South African example is an interesting one. And there's a lot to learn, not just in the fact that the sugar tax came on board, but also that it was actually to some extent accompanied by salt legislation, for example. And then there's a whole lot of other policies that are also in place. The lesson to me that South Africa gives me is that when you're sitting in Zambia or Malawi, you kind of think, if I had mandatory fortification, if I had a sugar tax, if I have salt legislation, if I could fortify with 11 micronutrients, wow, I would have arrived. If I could have a full school feeding program that is scaled up and it's been running since, I don't know, 1994, great. And yet when we look at the health outcomes, they do not match the policy that is there, the amount of data that is being collected and what have you. And those of us sitting on the side think, if I could be like that, then I could make a big difference. So for me, South Africa offers two examples. One is, how can we work with policymakers to actually get some of these policies in place? They've done that extremely well, and they've done that through convincing policymakers with evidence. So that's one lesson. The other lesson is what not to do, in terms of, you can actually have all these wonderful policies in place and actually being implemented and not necessarily have the desired outcomes, because somehow the accountability aspect of things is not entirely there. So if you go to the supermarkets and to the shops and to see what the companies are actually doing, the food environment does not speak to the kind of evidence that is actually being generated and the trade-offs thereof. So two lessons: we can sing on the one hand and do the praise thing about the goat, but we must also look at lessons on, but why is it not having as accelerated an impact as it should, given all the policies that are running simultaneously? Thank you.
Thanks, Namakolo. That's some food for thought. Because, yeah, there's obviously also other factors at play that we haven't even touched upon when thinking about food environment and consumption or dietary patterns in many countries in the region. When you think of cultural beliefs or norms when it comes to purchasing certain food types or foodstuffs, and even if there would be policy in place that would not be met by the by demand or the uptake, so there might be some discrepancy there. But maybe I don't know if you should go there, Amos, or maybe in the interest of time, if we should go for maybe a quick round, if there's any other.
Sorry about the time. The timer on the screen is wrong. We actually have just about 5 minutes. Yeah, we have about 5 minutes. So the timer here is wrong. So you're doing the right thing. If you could go around and find out if people have anything to say within that time. I'm moving to the other room now. Thank you.
Thanks, Amos. Is there anybody who wants to raise his hand, who wants to comment on what has been discussed so far? In quite an interesting session, I think. Who has not had the floor? Who wants to share some thoughts, comments, or experience on what is happening in his or her country? I know it's been a long day, but maybe somebody still has some interesting insights. If not, I would just like to raise one last point, because I was intrigued by the opening plenary this morning by David Nabarro, in which he somehow pleaded for, maybe I got it wrong, but maybe my impression was that, okay, that we should not discard the private sector altogether, that there might be more willingness than we expect, that there might be changing mindset. And my experience with voluntary regulations, for example, from the private sector, is that, okay, they cannot be trusted when you think about big food, and alcohol and marketing tactics. But maybe there's some other comments, and I would like to open this up to the floor for maybe a last quick comment on the role of the private industry as a stakeholder in this process. Namokolo?
Yes, the private sector is critical. I mean, we all buy our food from them, so they are a big component of our food environment. But I think the private sector responds to losses. If it's going to infringe on their business plans, they pay attention. And so a good example is when the sugar taxes were coming in. It doesn't matter where, they fought really hard Same thing about the salt. It's gonna make the products not so good and what have you and stuff like that, but still they managed to reduce the salt levels, and because it was encroaching on their business plans. So two things in dealing with the private sector is perhaps also the same way we need to convince government and make a business case for it. Private sector needs to also be approached in terms of a business case for whatever, because if we are advocating for changes in consumption, if private sector thinks they're going to lose out on market share if they don't come on board, they will probably come along. So I think we need to do better also at making a business case for them doing better, and then perhaps through that and corporate responsibility, maybe we could make a difference. But they're definitely an important part of the process. The question is how to do it without falling into their traps of selling us even more junk. Yeah.
That is indeed the $1 million question almost when it comes to dealing with the private sector. We all know the stories of the tactics used by the tobacco industry and the alcohol industry for the same token, basically. So to what extent can we build trustworthy relationships with the private sector in order to come to a mutually beneficial or reciprocal relationship in terms of regulating the food environment? I think that's a very important question. And I would be open to any suggestions or comments from others if they still arise. If not, I see this one question in the chat. This is Chukwuemeka, who asks how we can become a member of FERN. I think the easiest way is just to contact Amos or the FERN Secretariat and ask to add the name to the listserv. There's not really a very formal process of becoming a member. You can provide your details via email if you can.
I think they can provide names to the invitations usually come from Phyllis, somebody. That's the person to get in touch with.
Okay, Phyllis, yes, obviously you can send it to Phyllis or even Chelsea, I think. Good. Is there anybody who wants to raise another issue, who has more thoughts at the end of this long day?
I just join you. Otherwise, we'll move back to the main room, and then the members from the other room are already there. We can join them there, and then I think Adama would be closing us.
Okay, perfect. So we should leave the breakout room and just go back to the main room.
Yes. Let me see if I can close it. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.